morning began like any other on the high plains. Quiet except for the wind combing through the tall grass and the slow, familiar sound of hooves pressing into damp earth, and Thomas Calder believed it would end the same way, with him returning to his small ranch by sundown, unaware that fate had already chosen him for something far greater. Because it was his horse, Ash, a gray gelding he had raised since a foal, who first sensed that the day was different, long before Thomas did. When the animal suddenly stopped at the edge of the creek, instead of crossing, as he always had, ears twitching, nostrils flaring, body tense as if listening to a call that didn't exist for human ears, and Thomas tugged gently on the reins, murmuring the horse's name with a half-smile, thinking it was nothing more than a spooked reaction to a scent or a shadow. But Ash did not move. He lowered his head and snorted, then took an unexpected step toward the reeds instead of the path home, and when Thomas tried again to guide him back, the horse resisted, planting his hooves firmly in the mud with a strength that surprised the man, and that was when Thomas noticed something else. Something subtle but unsettling. The birds had gone quiet, the breeze seemed to hold its breath, and the land itself felt as though it were waiting. And against his better judgment, Thomas loosened the reins, trusting the animal that had never once led him astray, unaware that this decision would pull him into a story of blood, survival, and a truth buried deeper than the roots of the cottonwoods lining the creek. Because as Ash moved forward, carefully, deliberately, Thomas caught sight of something unnatural among the reeds. A faint movement, a shape that did not belong, and as they drew closer, the smell reached him first, iron and earth, the unmistakable scent of blood, and his heart tightened as he dismounted, boots sinking into the wet ground, hand instinctively moving to the rifle slung across his shoulder. Not in aggression, but caution, because the frontier had taught him that danger often announced itself only after it was too late. And when he parted the reeds, he saw her, lying partially submerged at the water's edge, her breathing shallow, her dark hair matted with blood, her clothing torn and soaked. An Apache woman, young but hardened by a life that had not been kind, her skin pale beneath streaks of dirt and red, a bullet wound torn through her side, still fresh, still angry. And for a long moment Thomas simply stood there, frozen, between fear and disbelief, because this was not just an injured stranger. This was a line drawn by history itself, a boundary most men of his world were taught never to cross. And yet Ash stepped closer, lowering his head, nudging the woman gently with his nose as if urging her to wake. And that simple act shattered the hesitation inside Thomas. Because if his horse, an animal guided only by instinct and loyalty, could show compassion without question, then what excuse did a man have to turn away? And as the woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open just enough to reveal a sharp, dark gaze filled with pain and defiance, Thomas realized she was still alive. Barely, and he knelt beside her, speaking softly, promising help though he wasn't sure she could understand him, and she tried to lift her hand, fingers trembling, before collapsing back against the earth, and in that moment Thomas knew he had no choice, because walking away would mean condemning her to death, and saving her would mean inviting consequences he could not yet imagine, consequences that might cost him his land, his safety, even his life. But as he lifted her carefully, feeling how light she was, how close she was to slipping away, Ash stood steady, calm, as if this had always been the path they were meant to take, and Thomas laid her across the horse's back with practiced care, binding her wound as best he could with his own shirt, his hands shaking not from fear but from the weight of what he was doing. And as they turned back toward the ranch, Thomas glanced over his shoulder once more, half expecting to see riders cresting the hills, soldiers or hunters drawn by blood. But the land remained silent, holding its secrets, and he did not know then that this silence was only the beginning, that forces far older and more dangerous than men were already watching. And as the sun climbed higher and Ash carried them forward with unwavering resolve, Thomas Calder rode toward a future he never imagined, guided not by reason or law, but by the unbreakable bond between a man and his horse. And if you feel the pull of this moment, if stories of courage born from impossible choices speak to something deep inside you, then stay with us. Because this is only the first step into a journey that will test loyalty, redefine humanity, and reveal a truth so unbelievable it will change everything. And before the next chapter unfolds, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, because stories like this are meant to be remembered, shared, and carried forward, just like the path Ash chose that morning, a path that would never allow any of them to return the same. By the time Thomas reached the ranch, The sun was already sliding westward, painting the sky in bruised shades of gold and red, and every step Ash took felt heavier than the last. Not because of the woman draped across his back, but because of the growing certainty in Thomas's chest that nothing about this night would end simply. And as the ranch house came into view, lonely against the wide open land, Thomas felt a strange tension tighten around his ribs, the kind that warned of storms before the clouds arrived, and he moved quickly, guiding Ash toward the barn instead of the front porch, knowing that secrecy, at least for now, was the only shield he had because word traveled fast in these parts, faster than justice and often sharper than truth. And when he lowered the woman carefully onto a bed of clean hay, the lantern light revealed the full extent of her injuries, the bullet wound ragged and inflamed, another gash along her shoulder, bruises blooming dark beneath her skin, and despite the pain etched into every line of her face, there was something unbroken in her expression, a quiet strength that made Thomas hesitate before touching her again. And when he cleaned the wound with shaking hands, she stirred, letting out a low sound that was more warning than cry, her eyes snapping open sharp as flint, and for a moment Thomas thought she might fight him even in this state. But instead her gaze locked onto his face, searching, measuring, and whatever she saw there must have convinced her to let him continue, because she did not resist, though her breathing quickened. And as he worked, Thomas spoke softly, not knowing if she understood his words or only the tone, telling her she was safe, that he wouldn't let anyone harm her, promises that felt fragile even as he spoke them, because safety was never guaranteed on the frontier, especially not for someone like her. And when the wound was bandaged and she slipped back into unconsciousness, Thomas leaned back against the stall wall, exhaustion washing over him like a tide, realizing only then how close he himself was to breaking. And outside the barn, Ash stamped once, then stood watch, ears forward, alert, as if guarding more than flesh and blood, as if guarding a destiny that had chosen them all without asking permission. The night deepened, bringing with it the distant howl of coyotes and the creak of wood settling in the cold, and Thomas barely slept, rising at every small sound, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. Who had shot her? Why she was alone? How long before someone came looking? And whether he had already crossed a line that could never be erased? And sometime before dawn, she woke again, this time fully, her eyes opening slowly, taking in the barn, the lantern, the man sitting nearby, and her hand moved weakly toward her side, stopping when she felt the bandage, and she looked at Thomas, then truly looked, and spoke a word he did not understand. Her voice rough but steady, and he answered honestly, telling her his name, that she was on his land, that he had found her by the creek, and though the language between them was broken, meaning found its way through the gaps, carried by gestures, by expressions, by the shared understanding of pain and survival. And when she said her name softly with pride, Naya, Thomas repeated it carefully, and she nodded once, approving. And in that simple exchange something shifted, a fragile bridge forming where only fear should have existed, and Thomas offered her water, helping her drink, noticing how her hands trembled not just from injury but from exhaustion, deeper than the body, and she spoke again more urgently now, pointing toward the hills, mimicking the sound of hooves, the crack of gunfire, and Thomas felt his stomach knot as the pieces began to fall into place. She was being hunted, not as a criminal but as prey, and whoever had done this would not stop simply because night had fallen. As the first light of morning crept into the barn, Thomas made a decision that terrified him more than any threat he could imagine. He would hide her, nurse her back to strength, and when she was able, help her return to her people. And he knew the risks, knew that sheltering an Apache woman could mark him as a traitor in the eyes of some, an enemy in the eyes of others, but the alternative, turning her over or abandoning her, felt like a betrayal not just of her but of himself. And Ash seemed to sense the resolve, blowing softly through his nostrils, and Thomas placed a hand against the horse's neck, grounding himself in the steady warmth there, because if he had learned anything from Ash, it was that loyalty was not a concept to be debated. It was a choice made in the moment when it mattered most. The day passed in a tense blur, Thomas keeping the ranch quiet, avoiding town, watching the horizon, while Naya slept fitfully, waking at times to speak in a language that flowed like water over stone, words Thomas could not understand but felt nonetheless. And in those moments he saw flashes of her life, the way her eyes hardened when she spoke of the past, the way they softened when she touched the small carved token she kept, hidden in her clothing, and he wondered what had been taken from her, what had driven her alone into danger. And as evening approached again, the answer came not in words but in sound, the distant thunder of hooves, faint at first then unmistakable, and Thomas's heart pounded as he peered through the barn door, spotting riders on the far ridge, silhouettes against the dying light moving with purpose, and he knew then that the hunt had reached his land, and that the choice he made by the creek had already set events in motion that could not be undone. Naya woke as if sensing the danger, pushing herself upright despite the pain, her eyes burning with urgency, and she pointed again, this time toward the barn loft, then toward the hills beyond, a plan forming in gestures and glances, and Thomas realized she had survived not by chance but by intelligence and will, and he trusted her instincts as much as he trusted Ash's, helping her move, hiding her above while he led Ash out into the open, hoping to draw attention away. And as the riders approached, their faces hard, their questions sharp, Thomas answered carefully, offering nothing, his pulse roaring in his ears, and though they searched, they did not find her, not yet. And when they finally rode off, frustration written in their movements, Thomas sagged with relief, knowing this was only a temporary victory. And when he climbed back to the loft, Naya looked at him with something new in her eyes, something like gratitude, something like trust, and without words, they understood that they were bound now, by choice and by circumstance. And if this story has you holding your breath, if you feel the weight of these moments as deeply as we do, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because the journey ahead grows darker, more dangerous, and far more unbelievable, and you won't want to miss what comes next. When loyalty is tested, spirits awaken, and a horse proves that fate sometimes walks on four legs. The second night after the riders came was heavier than the first, thick with a tension that pressed against the walls of the barn and settled into Thomas's bones, and sleep became impossible, not because of fear alone, but because something deeper was stirring, something that felt older than the land deeds and fences and laws men had carved into the plains. And as Thomas sat on an overturned crate sharpening his knife by lantern light, he felt the unmistakable sense of being watched, not by enemies in the dark but by the land itself, as if the earth remembered things men preferred to forget. And above him in the loft, Naya lay awake as well, her breathing shallow, her hand pressed against the bandage at her side, her eyes open and reflecting the dim light like still water. And when she finally spoke, her voice low and steady, she told a story not in perfect English but in fragments, in images stitched together by memory and pain, of a patrol that came too close to a sacred place, of an argument that turned into violence, of her people scattering into the hills while she stayed behind to draw the soldiers away. And Thomas listened without interrupting, because he understood, enough to know that what she was telling him was not an excuse but a truth. And as she spoke, her words were punctuated by the soft sound of Ash shifting below, the horse restless in a way Thomas had never seen, pacing, stopping, lifting his head toward the open doors as if listening to something beyond human hearing. And when Naya noticed this, her expression changed, a flicker of recognition passing across her face, and she said a word softly, reverently, one Thomas did not know but felt nonetheless. And she explained that Ash was not just a horse, not just an animal bound by reins and training, but a walker between moments, a guide, one who listened when the world whispered warnings. And Thomas might have dismissed such words once, might have smiled politely and chalked them up to superstition, but not now. Not after the way Ash had stopped by the creek, not after the way he had stood guard without command. And Thomas felt something inside him loosen, a door opening to possibilities he had never allowed himself to consider. Before dawn the warning came, carried on the wind and confirmed by Ash's sudden sharp whinny, and Thomas rushed outside to see torches moving in the distance. Not many, but enough. The riders back again, more determined, more dangerous, and this time there would be no polite questions, no half-hearted search, because men who hunt long enough begin to believe they are owed blood, and Naya knew it too, forcing herself to stand, her face pale but resolute, insisting they could not stay, that the land would turn against them if they did. And Thomas hesitated only long enough to grab supplies, trusting her instincts over his own fear, and together they moved into the hills, Ash leading without hesitation, choosing paths Thomas had never taken, narrow trails hidden by brush, rocky passes that seemed impossible, until the horse navigated them with sure-footed grace, and behind them, the shouts of men echoed faintly, growing frustrated as the terrain swallowed tracks and scattered sound. And as the sun rose, painting the sky in pale fire, Thomas felt the world narrowing to three beings moving as one, bound by necessity and something far stronger. By midday, Naya's strength faltered, the wound reopening slightly, and they took shelter in a shallow canyon where water trickled over stone. And as Thomas worked to clean and rebind the injury, he saw the scars crisscrossing her skin, a map of survival etched into flesh, and she watched him closely, studying his face with the same careful attention she might give the land before a storm. And in that quiet space, surrounded by stone and sky, she spoke again, telling him of the old belief that sometimes a horse is born with a spirit meant to guide lost souls, not just its rider but anyone standing at a crossroads. And Thomas felt a chill at the words, because he knew then that this was not coincidence, that Ash had not simply wandered toward a wounded stranger, but had recognized a moment when the path of one life could change many. And when Thomas looked at the horse, standing alert at the canyon mouth, he no longer saw just an animal but a guardian, a witness to something sacred unfolding. The riders found them before sunset, not by skill but by chance, a shouted curse echoing through the canyon, and suddenly the stillness shattered, gunfire cracking against stone, bullets sparking, dust exploding, and Thomas reacted on instinct, pulling Naya behind cover, returning fire not to kill but to slow, to create space. And Ash reared once, then charged forward, a blur of muscle and motion, scattering the men just long enough for Thomas to help Naya onto his back. And as they fled deeper into the canyon, something unbelievable happened. The sound of the pursuit faded, not because the riders gave up, but because the canyon itself seemed to close, echoes twisting, paths diverging, confusion spreading among the hunters as if the land had chosen a side. And when they finally emerged into open high ground, breathless but alive, Thomas laughed once, a sharp, disbelieving sound, and Naya looked at him with awe and certainty, telling him the spirits had accepted him now, whether he wanted them to or not. As night fell again, they rested beneath a sky heavy with stars, and Thomas realized there was no going back to the life he had known, no returning to simple days and quiet fences, because he had crossed a boundary far greater than law. And if this chapter has pulled you deeper into the mystery, if you feel the danger and wonder rising with every step, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about fate, sacrifice, and the impossible bond between a horse and the lives it chooses to save. And the final chapter will reveal a truth so powerful, it will stay with you long after the story ends. The final crossing came at dawn, when the sky was neither night nor day but something in between, a pale breath held by the horizon, and Thomas felt the weight of every step Ash took, as if it were measured by the land itself. Because by then he understood that they were no longer simply fleeing men on horseback. They were moving toward an ending that had been written long before any of them were born. And Naya sensed it too, sitting upright now despite the pain, her back straight, her eyes clear, as if strength were flowing into her from the earth beneath them. And when they reached the ridge overlooking the valley where her people waited, hidden and watchful, she asked Thomas to stop, to let the moment settle, and Ash obeyed instantly, lowering his head as if in reverence. And for a long time none of them spoke, because words felt too small for what had been shared, and Thomas realized with a sudden ache that this was goodbye. Not just to Naya, but to the life he had known, the one where choices were simple and consequences belonged to someone else. And Naya turned to him then, placing her hand over his, her touch steady, grounding, and she spoke carefully, thanking him not as one thanks a rescuer, but as one thanks an equal, someone who chose courage when fear would have been easier. And she told him that Ash had not led him to her by chance, that some souls are meant to be tested, and when they are, the world watches to see what they will do. And Thomas felt tears sting his eyes, not from sadness alone but from the overwhelming understanding that in saving her, he had been saved too. From a life lived too cautiously, too quietly. The moment shattered with the crack of a rifle shot, the sound tearing through the valley like lightning, and chaos erupted as riders burst from the trees below, desperation driving them forward in one final push. And Thomas moved without thinking, swinging down from Ash, placing himself between Naya and the threat, firing to cover her retreat as Apache warriors emerged from the rocks, swift and silent, the land itself seeming to rise with them. And in the confusion, Ash charged again, Not away but forward, straight into the chaos, scattering men and horses alike, his presence commanding attention, fear, awe, and in that moment Thomas saw it clearly. Ash was not running from danger. He was ending it, and when the dust settled, the riders fled, broken and defeated, leaving behind only echoes and regret, and Naya was gone, taken safely by her people into the hills. But before she disappeared, she looked back once, raising her hand in a gesture that was both farewell and blessing, and Thomas knew he would carry that moment for the rest of his life. When he returned to his ranch days later, the land felt different, not quieter but fuller, as if something invisible had been restored, and Ash walked beside him, calm again, his task complete, and though rumors spread, as rumors always do, of a rancher who helped an Apache woman escape, of a horse that led men astray, nothing ever came of them, because some truths resist being pinned down by words or law, and Thomas lived on, changed in ways that mattered, helping where he could, listening more closely, trusting the quiet instincts he once ignored, and sometimes at dawn or dusk, he would see a figure on a distant ridge standing still, watching, and he would feel a sense of peace knowing that paths, once crossed, never truly separate. And if this story stayed with you, if the bond between a man, a horse, and a wounded stranger moved something inside you, then take a moment now to subscribe to the channel, because stories like this are more than entertainment. They are reminders of who we can be when the moment asks everything of us, and by subscribing you help keep these stories alive, carried forward just like Ash carried destiny on his back, one impossible choice at a time.